Some prices are paid in silence, with no witnesses, but desperation and the cold indifference of circumstance. England, 1816. The sitting room at Merritt House held the faded elegance of better years. Cream wallpaper, once fashionable, now bore the subtle discoloration of time and careless servants. Vivian Merritt sat rigid on the settee, her back straight despite the weight pressing against her chest, as the Duke's man of business delivered his final assessment. The pale blue morning gown she wore was her best, altered twice to maintain its utility, though both she and Mr. Ashton knew that appearance mattered little when discussing figures that could no longer be altered by mere economy. "The situation is untenable, Miss Merritt," Mr. Ashton said, adjusting his spectacles. His tone suggested neither sympathy nor judgment, only the dispassionate delivery of facts. "Your father's investments in the West Indies have yielded nothing but loss. The creditors grow impatient. Your mother's widow's portion is depleted. The household accounts show a deficit that cannot be remedied through retrenchment alone." Vivian's fingers tightened around the arms of the settee. She was 26, old enough to understand what remained unspoken. Without marriage and a suitable dote from that marriage, her mother would face poverty, and her younger sister Harriet, barely 21, would have no prospects whatsoever. The social machinery of London required capital. It required husbands with fortunes. It required, above all, daughters who could attract them. "Is there nothing?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She had spent the past weeks calculating, recalculating, searching for solutions that did not exist. Nothing within conventional means. Mr. Ashton closed his ledger with finality. "A marriage remains your family's only salvation, Miss Merritt, a substantial marriage. Your father understood this before his passing, which is why he attempted those ventures in the first place. The execution was unfortunate, but the intention was sound." After he departed, Vivian remained motionless in the sitting room. Through the window, London stretched indifferently. The ton had already moved past her. She was neither young enough to be fresh nor beautiful enough to overcome a lack of prospects. Her elder sisters were married years ago, their matches modest but respectable. She was the third daughter, the overlooked one, the companion to aging aunts at social functions, the woman others spoke around rather than to. It was therefore extraordinary when, 3 days later, the Duke's man of business bearing the crest of the Duke of Lexington requested an audience at Merritt House. Vivian did not know him. She knew nothing of any Duke's interest in her family. Yet here was Mr. Thomas Fairfield. Mr. Thomas Fairfield, the Duke's man of business, requested an audience at Merritt House 3 days later. He carried the Lexington crest, along with the practiced calm of a gentleman accustomed to speaking of sums that decided other people's fates. Impeccably dressed and carrying a manner that suggested he conducted such business regularly. They spoke in the drawing room, a room Vivian had ensured was presentable despite her modest circumstances. Fairfield settled into a chair as though accustomed to shabby furnishings, and opened a leather folder with deliberate care. "The Duke of Lexington is in a particular situation," he began without preamble. "He requires marriage, not for romantic reasons, you understand, but to satisfy a clause within his father's will. The late Duke stipulated that his heir marry before reaching his 33rd year, or risk the entailment passing to a distant cousin. Your Grace is now 32. The deadline approaches." Vivian listened, uncertain why a duke would conduct such business with her. She said nothing. "My employer has observed you," Fairfield continued, his words measured. "He values discretion, intelligence, a certain composure under pressure. He has need of a wife who understands the nature of such arrangements. Not a woman seeking affection or romantic attachment, not a woman whose ambitions exceed her station. Someone practical, someone who would accept an agreement for what it genuinely is." There it was, the opening of a door Vivian had believed sealed shut forever. "What arrangement?" she asked, though her voice felt distant from her body. 1 year of marriage, a salary paid to you, and a generous dote to be settled upon your family immediately. After the year concludes and the will's requirements are satisfied, a quiet articles of separation. Your reputation would not suffer. You would be established, your family secured. The Duke would be free of his father's demands. Vivian's throat had gone dry. Why would such a man require deception? Surely he could marry anyone in England. He could, Fairfield agreed, which is precisely why he wishes not to. A woman of his rank might develop expectations, might expect that a marriage, even contractual, contained elements of affection or permanence. The Duke is not in a position to offer such things. He requires discretion and understanding above all else. She did not ask what had made him unsuitable for genuine marriage. She did not ask whether he was cruel or broken or simply unfeeling. Those questions seemed somehow dangerous. If I refuse, she asked instead, then the Duke finds another. There are always women in difficult circumstances willing to negotiate. Fairfield's expression did not change. However, the offer stands, a substantial one. He named a figure. It was enough to clear the creditors, establish her mother in comfort, provide her sister with a dote that would attract at least a respectable gentleman. It was everything her family required. It was the price of their survival. Vivian asked for 2 days to consider. She spent those 2 days in a state of curious detachment, as though observing someone else's life. She walked through the garden her mother had once tended. She sat with Harriet, who chattered about dance cards and the possibility of marriage. She watched her mother's hands tremble as she attempted needlework, watched the resignation in her eyes when creditors' letters arrived. On the 3rd day, she signed the contract in Fairfield's office. The words blurred as she read them. Marriage for 1 calendar year, financial compensation, discretion required, understanding that sentiment played no role in the arrangement. Nothing about genuine companionship. The clause, as Fairfield explained, empowers the trustees to treat any union as a sham should there be reasonable signs of collusion or evasion, separate establishments, an absence of cohabitation, no shared management of household accounts, or other proofs of convenience rather than life joined. In such case, the estate devolves to the named cousin. Nothing about the more damning details of what the Duke's will actually demanded. She would learn those later, but by then it would be far too late to matter. The dote was transferred within the week. Her mother received medical care for the first time in years. Harriet attended a proper dressmaker. The household staff was increased. Credit was restored. The machinery of social survival, previously grinding toward failure, lurched back into motion. And Vivian Merritt prepared to meet the Duke of Lexington, a man whose name she had not known 1 month prior, and who now owned the contract to her time, her presence, and her discretion for the next 12 months. The chapel at Lexington House was smaller than Vivian had anticipated, with gray stone walls and tall windows through which autumn light filtered in dusty columns. There were no guests. No flowers adorned the aisles. No choir sang. Only herself, dressed in a gown of pale cream silk that had been hastily commissioned, and James Lexington, the Duke, who stood beside her with an expression of calculated neutrality, as the vicar intoned words that felt simultaneously momentous and hollow. She wondered if he was thinking about his first wedding. She wondered if he had loved his wife. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome, and she pushed it aside as the vicar asked for her vow. Her voice, when she spoke, sounded distant to her own ears. She repeated the promises required by law and tradition, to have and to hold, for better or for worse, until death did them part. All of it rendered nearly meaningless by the contract locked in Fairfield's office, a legal document that superseded these sacred words with far more precise language regarding termination. The Duke placed a ring on her finger, gold, elegant, bearing a small diamond that caught the light. It felt heavy. It felt like a shackle. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar said with enthusiasm, clearly unaware that he was performing theater rather than ceremony. The Duke leaned toward her. His lips brushed hers with the briefest contact, coolly executed, entirely without passion. It was the kiss of diplomatic protocol rather than matrimonial intimacy. When he pulled back, she found his gray eyes studying her with the same dispassionate interest he might regard a new acquisition for his estate. "It is done," he said quietly. Not to her precisely, but to the universe at large. The carriage that bore her to Lexington Manor, her new residence, felt cavernous. By house custom, a relic of the late Duke's iron propriety, the bridal couple traveled in separate coaches. Tradition, the butler had called it. Distance, she thought. She sat alone for most of the journey, though the Duke's carriage followed some distance behind. The landscape transformed gradually from London's cramped geography to rolling hills and open parkland. The manor itself emerged from the afternoon mist, like something from a fairy tale, all honey-colored stone and mullioned windows, approached by a drive lined with ancient oaks. It was beautiful. It was also, she recognized with absolute clarity, a prison of considerable elegance. The servants assembled in the entrance hall, 40 of them, she would later learn, though they seemed like hundreds in that moment, all observing her with the careful neutrality of people trained to make no judgments while missing nothing. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ashworth, a woman of perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair and sharper eyes, curtsied with mechanical precision. "Welcome to Lexington Manor, Your Grace," she said. The title felt false on her lips, or perhaps false was simply how titles sounded when applied to someone who had earned them through contract rather than birth or merit. Mrs. Ashworth guided her through corridors lined with portraits of previous dukes and duchesses, women whose painted faces gazed down with the serene confidence of those whose positions had never been temporary. Vivienne was shown to the Duchess's chambers, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and pale blue. The bed was enormous, with heavy damask curtains. A writing desk occupied one corner. Through tall windows, she could see the park spreading endlessly beyond the glass. "Dinner will be served at 8 o'clock in the family dining room," Mrs. Ashworth explained. "The Dowager Duchess requested that you attend. She wishes to make your acquaintance." Vivienne dressed in one of the new gowns that had been prepared for her arrival, pale green silk with delicate embroidery at the cuffs and neckline. She sat before the mirror as her lady's maid, a woman named Ellen, assigned to her that morning, arranged her hair. In the reflection, she saw a woman she barely recognized, the bride. The Duchess, the fraud. The Dowager Duchess occupied the dining room like a general commanding territory. She was perhaps 60, with the bearing of a woman accustomed to absolute obedience. Her dark eyes, identical to her son's in shape, though far colder in expression, assessed Vivienne with the clinical precision of someone evaluating livestock at market. "So," she said, setting down her fork with deliberate emphasis, "you are the girl James has seen fit to marry." "Yes, Your Grace," Vivienne replied, maintaining her composure though her hands felt numb. "You understand what is required of the Duchess of Lexington?" "I believe so, Your Grace." The Dowager's mouth tightened. "You must oversee the household staff. You must attend all necessary social functions. You must ensure that the Lexington name remains above reproach. And most importantly, you must provide the Duke with an heir. That is your primary function. All else is secondary." Vivienne felt, rather than saw, the Duke shift beside her. He offered no defense of her, no indication that he disagreed with his mother's assessment. He simply continued eating as though the conversation was of no particular interest. The weeks that followed took on a strange rhythm. Mrs. Ashworth educated Vivienne on the complexities of managing the household, the staff hierarchies, the ceremonial requirements of her position. She learned which servants ranked above which, how meals were to be timed, which drawing rooms were used for which occasions. She learned the names of dozens of distant relatives who might visit. She learned that the Duke's mother had opinions about everything and expressed them with exhausting frequency. But she also began to notice peculiarities in the Duke's behavior that troubled her in ways she could not quite articulate. He was, on the surface, a perfectly adequate husband. They appeared in public together. He provided her with appropriate jewelry. He introduced her to his associates. In company, he maintained the polite distance appropriate to a gentleman of his rank. But in the privacy of their separate chambers, for he did not join her in the Duchess's bed, she heard him pacing through the night hours. Mrs. Ashworth mentioned in passing that the Duke often spent evenings in the library. Sometimes he did not retire at all. When they were alone together, which was rare, he seemed almost uncomfortable in her presence. Once, she encountered him in the portrait gallery, standing before a painting of a woman with pale hair and a gentle expression. He turned when she entered, and something flickered across his face, a shadow, quickly suppressed. "Your first wife?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Yes," he replied tersely, and walked away. It was 4 weeks after the wedding when Lady Catherine Westcott arrived. She came ostensibly to attend a supper party, a widow of considerable beauty and substantial fortune, dressed in crimson silk that seemed designed to draw every eye in the room. More than that, she seemed to be designed specifically to draw the Duke's eye, and he found hers with regularity that made Vivian's chest tighten unpleasantly. The supper itself was torturous. Lady Catherine sat across from the Duke, and they conversed with the ease of long acquaintance. They shared references, finished each other's sentences, laughed at shared jokes that others at the table found inexplicable. Once, Lady Catherine leaned forward, placing her hand on the Duke's arm, and he did not pull away. "Your Grace and I attended the Harrington musical together, did we not?" Lady Catherine said, her voice carrying a particular inflection. "3 seasons ago, before your marriage. How the time has flown." The implication was subtle but unmistakable. There was a before. A time when the Duke had been unattached, uncontracted, free to enjoy the company of women like Catherine. And Catherine had been part of that before. After dinner, Lady Catherine requested a tour of the manor. The Duke obliged, and Vivian watched them disappear into the corridor together, Catherine's hand tucked through his arm, their heads bent toward one another in conversation so intimate it seemed to require no external witnesses. She sat in the drawing room and tried to embroider. Her stitches went crooked. She set the needlework aside and walked to the window. The park beyond was dark, but she could hear the murmur of their voices coming from the library, where the French doors opened onto the terrace. In that moment, sitting alone in a manner that was supposed to be hers but felt entirely foreign, Vivian Merritt, now Vivian Lexington, understood that she had made a misreading of the true price she would pay. The contract she had signed had been incomplete. The details she had not been told were proving far more significant than those she had been promised. The Duke did not love her. That much was obvious. But he appeared to have some attachment to Lady Catherine, and that discovery shifted something fundamental in Vivian's understanding of what she had agreed to endure. She was not simply a placeholder for a year. She was, she realized with absolute certainty, an obstacle to something the Duke actually wanted. The question that kept her awake that night was whether he despised her for it, or merely viewed her with the same detached indifference he seemed to direct toward everything in his life. Neither option provided comfort. Neither option suggested that the next 12 months would be anything other than an exercise in endurance. The seasons shifted at Lexington Manor with the slow inevitability of time marked by soil and stone rather than calendar pages. Winter arrived in November with frost that crystallized the park's edges, and by December the manor had transformed into something resembling the residence Vivian had begun to inhabit rather than merely occupy. She had, through a combination of observation and quiet determination, gained an understanding of the household that Mrs. Ashworth begrudgingly acknowledged. It started with small changes. The servants, initially wary of the new Duchess, began to respond to her requests without the studied delay that characterized their obedience to the Dowager. She had reorganized the china stores without being asked, had noticed that a particular corridor remained cold regardless of fire placement, and had the chimney examined, finding a bird's nest blocking the flue. When Mrs. Ashworth fell ill in late October, Vivian had quietly assumed her duties for 3 days until the housekeeper recovered, managing the household accounts with an efficiency that surprised even herself. The Dowager noticed. Her response was to criticize Vivian's methods while simultaneously ceasing to interfere with them, which constituted, in the older woman's vocabulary, something approaching approval. But more significant than her growing mastery of the household was the unexpected development of genuine conversation between herself and the Duke. It began innocuously enough. He encountered her in the library late one evening when she had gone to retrieve a book recommended by Lord Fairfield. He was standing before the fireplace, a glass of brandy in one hand, his dark coat rumpled from hours of similar standing and similar silence. "You read Wordsworth," he observed, noting the volume in her hands. "When opportunity permits," she replied carefully. "Do you?" "My father did," obsessively. He turned from the fire, studying her with an intensity that had become familiar. He believed poetry contained answers to moral questions. That verse could guide a man toward virtue. Vivian waited. There was something beneath the words, some weight that demanded acknowledgement rather than immediate response. "He was often disappointed," James continued, settling into a chair. "In both poetry and myself." She sat across from him, maintaining a distance that felt both cowardly and necessary. What form did his disappointment take? He swirled the brandy, watching the light play through the glass. My father believed that men of rank bore specific obligations: duty to estate, duty to legacy, duty to produce heirs who would be educated toward virtue rather than allowed to develop natural inclinations. He paused. He died believing I had failed in all three. Did you? She asked, then immediately regretted the presumption. But he did not seem offended. His will suggests that he did not trust me to make correct choices independently. Hence the requirement that I marry before reaching 3 and 30. As though a wife might somehow correct what years of example and expectation had failed to remedy. Vivian felt something shift in her understanding of the contract. It was not then a simple matter of satisfying a financial provision. It was a father's posthumous attempt to shape his son through constraint and legal obligation. It was, she recognized, a kind of desperation, the last weapon of a man who had lost all other influence. And has marriage remedied it? She asked quietly. James looked at her directly, and in his eyes was something she had not seen before. Something that looked almost like loneliness. It is remarkable how ineffective marriage proves at correcting fundamental character flaws, is it not? Over the following weeks, these conversations became routine. They began to spend evenings in the library together, not always speaking, sometimes simply reading in companionable silence. He would occasionally ask her opinion on matters of estate management. She discovered that beneath his perpetual distance, he was possessed of a dry wit that emerged when he was relaxed. More alarmingly, she discovered that she was beginning to anticipate seeing him, that her mood shifted when he entered a room. In mid-December, as snow began to fall heavily outside the library windows, she finally asked him directly about her own sacrifice. They had been discussing her family, and somehow the conversation had turned to why she had accepted the contract. "My mother has not worked since my father's death," Vivian said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission. "My sister has no dote. The household servants were unpaid for months. I watched my mother's hands shake when letters from creditors arrived. I watched my sister accept that she would not marry, would not have children, would not have the life she had been promised since birth. When Mr. Fairfield offered an escape, even a temporary one, I could not refuse." James was silent for a long moment. "You sacrificed your own prospects for theirs. I sacrificed a prospect that was no longer viable. I am 26, Your Grace. My chances of a love match were already negligible. This contract at least provides a service to my family." "And what do you sacrifice now?" he asked quietly. She did not answer immediately. The answer involved admitting that she had begun to feel things she had not contracted to feel, that watching him maintain distance with Lady Catherine had begun to cause her genuine distress, that she was developing a care for his company that violated the terms they had both agreed upon. "Whatever is required," she finally said, which was not an answer at all. He rose from his chair and approached her. She remained seated, watching as he stood before her, his hand reaching to touch her cheek with a gentleness that contradicted everything about the contract that governed them. For a moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely, there was only the two of them and the sound of snow accumulating against the windows. Then he moved toward her, and she felt him lean closer, and she understood with certainty that he was about to kiss her, really kiss her, the way the chapel vicar had done at their wedding, but with all the intention and feeling that that moment had lacked. But at the last moment, when his lips were mere inches from hers, something flickered across his face, a shadow, a fear. He pulled back abruptly, stepping away from her as though she had burned him. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rough. That was inappropriate. Before she could formulate a response, he left the library entirely, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. Vivian sat alone by the dying fire, her hand rising to her cheek where she could still feel the echo of his touch. She understood in that moment that her heart had become a liability, that caring for him transformed the contract from a temporary arrangement into something far more dangerous. 2 days later, a letter arrived from her mother. It bore the seal of the Duke's man of business and contained news that temporarily distracted her from the turmoil of her own feelings. Harriet had received 3 marriage proposals. 3 young gentlemen of respectable family and adequate fortune, apparently convinced that any sister of the Duchess of Lexington must be suitable. Their mother, the letter explained, had accepted the best offer on Harriet's behalf. An earl's second son, kind enough by reputation, with an estate in Northumberland. And their mother herself was moving to Bath, where a friend had provided a small residence. She would no longer live in fear of creditors. She would have servants. She would have peace. The contract had done what it was meant to do. Her family was saved, and Vivian found, reading the words describing their security, that she felt simultaneously relieved and trapped. The original purpose of the arrangement had been fulfilled. There was no reason for her to remain beyond the contracted year, no reason for the Duke to keep her, no reason for this growing attachment to continue. Yet when she encountered him the following morning at breakfast, he looked at her with such careful indifference that she understood he was attempting to rebuild the walls that the moment in the library had fractured, and she recognized, with absolute despair, that she would let him, because the alternative was acknowledging that she had become an obstacle to both their futures. The evening that Lady Catherine Westcott returned to Lexington Manor arrived with all the subtlety of a storm warning ignored. It was late January, the new year settling into its stride with frost clinging to windows, and the promise of spring still distant enough to feel mythical. In January, during the ensuing fortnight, Catherine's charm hardened into strategy. The library became a stage for confidences pitched too softly to be innocent, the long gallery a corridor where laughter traveled farther than propriety, and servants' whispers did the rest. Vivian had not anticipated her arrival. The Dowager Duchess mentioned it in passing during breakfast, delivered with the tone of someone announcing an inevitability, rather than offering information that might be received with genuine interest. "Lady Catherine will be joining us for supper," the older woman said, buttering her toast with mechanical precision. "She finds London insufferably crowded this season and has accepted an invitation to spend a fortnight at the country house. I expect you to ensure that the guest suites are adequately prepared." Vivian had nodded, committing the details to memory while maintaining her composure. She had no reason to object. Lady Catherine was a widow of considerable means, a woman of rank, entirely appropriate as a house guest. The fact that Vivian's stomach had tightened at the news seemed entirely unreasonable, and therefore something to be suppressed rather than acknowledged. The supper began well enough. The dining room glittered with candlelight, the table laden with courses that Mrs. Ashworth had executed with meticulous attention. Vivian had worn a gown of deep bronze silk, chosen not for Lady Catherine's benefit but for her own resolve. If she was to witness whatever this evening contained, she would do so adorned in something other than resignation. But the moment Catherine entered, every preparation Vivian had constructed crumbled into ineffectuality. The widow moved through the room with the careless grace of someone utterly confident in her place. Her gown was white silk trimmed with pearls, making Vivian's bronze appear suddenly pedestrian and overwrought. More significantly, Catherine's eyes found James immediately, and they smiled at each other with a recognition that seemed to require no external validation. "Your Grace," Catherine said, extending her hand. James took it with a courtesy that seemed, to Vivian's increasingly tormented observation, to linger fractionally longer than propriety demanded. "How it does warm my heart to see you again. London has been absolutely dreadful without the pleasure of your company." "Lady Catherine, you are most welcome," he replied, and his voice had changed. It carried a warmth that Vivian had never heard directed toward anything in this house. A lightness that suggested the careful distance he maintained was somehow lifted in this woman's presence. Dinner proceeded with agonizing slowness. Catherine and James conducted a conversation that was almost entirely impenetrable to others at the table. They referenced events that had occurred before Vivian's arrival, shared observations about mutual acquaintances with the ease of long intimacy, laughed at remarks that seemed to require no explanation to each other, though they mystified everyone else present. Once, when the second course was being served, Catherine turned to James and asked about a particular musicale, adding with deliberate emphasis, "Do you remember, 3 seasons ago, before you were married, you said that Signora Rinaldi's soprano was ruined by her insistence on embellishment?" The implication was inescapable. There had been a before, a time when James had attended concerts and formed opinions about singers' technical abilities, a time when he had existed in a world that Catherine inhabited. and that world had concluded with his marriage to a woman who had never attended any concert at all. When the meat course arrived, Catherine reached across to touch James's arm, drawing his attention to something she had noticed in one of the paintings adorning the dining room walls. Her gloved fingers remained on his coat for perhaps 3 seconds longer than necessary. Vivienne watched him not pull away. She watched him turn to Catherine with genuine interest in what she was indicating. She watched the intimacy of the moment with a growing sense of displacement, as though she was observing events occurring in a room she was not actually permitted to enter. After dinner, when the ladies traditionally retired and gentlemen remained for brandy and cigars, Catherine made a request that the Dowager Duchess seemed to find entirely reasonable. "Your Grace, would you permit me to view the gallery? I have heard reports of your renovations to the East Wing, and I confess I should dearly like to see the improvements with my own eyes. Perhaps your son might show me? He would certainly know the details of the work better than anyone." The Dowager Duchess gave her approval. James rose from his chair with what seemed to Vivienne like indecent haste. He offered Catherine his arm with a formality that somehow transformed the gesture into something far more intimate than mere courtesy. Together they departed the room, and Vivienne was left with the Dowager and 2 other visiting ladies, all of whom suddenly seemed intensely focused on the needlework project being discussed. Vivienne excused herself shortly after, pleading a headache that was only partially fabricated. She made her way to the drawing room, where she attempted to occupy herself with embroidery that had become increasingly familiar work. The stitches, however, were not cooperating. Her fingers had gone clumsy, her attention fractured between the needlepoint and the acute awareness of where James was at that moment. She heard their voices eventually, coming from the direction of the library. They were not in conversation. Rather, she heard him speaking about a particular edition of something, and Catherine's laughter in response. The sound of her laughter produced in Vivienne a physical sensation akin to being struck. It was an unsettling realization. This knowledge that she could be so affected by the happiness of another person, particularly when that happiness seemed to exclude her entirely. Rising from her chair, Vivienne moved toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace, though the January night was far too cold for any reasonable person to venture outside. Through the glass, she could see nothing but her own reflection staring back at her, a ghost of a woman trapped on the wrong side of perception. The conversation from the library carried through the open door of the adjacent room. Catherine was asking about a book. James was retrieving it from a shelf. Their voices were lower now, more private, suggesting discussions that required discretion rather than the formal courtesy of drawing room interaction. Vivienne stood motionless, listening to the murmur of exchange, unable to distinguish individual words but entirely capable of recognizing the tone. Comfortable, familiar, the vocabulary of 2 people who had known each other for considerably longer than the duration of her marriage. By the time she forced herself to return to her chair, Vivienne had reached several uncomfortable conclusions. The first was that she had been profoundly naive in accepting the contract without demanding complete disclosure of its terms. The second was that her position in this household had been compromised from the beginning by details she had not been permitted to know. The third, and most difficult to acknowledge, was that she had been experiencing an emotion for the Duke that violated every tenet of their arrangement. The evening stretched on interminably. Eventually, Catherine and James emerged from the library, and there followed the awkward ritual of conventional civility that meant nothing. James ensured that Catherine was adequately settled in her guest chambers. He bid Vivienne good night with a courtesy that felt almost like an insult in its impersonality. And Vivienne retired to the Duchess's chambers, where she found that sleep was impossible, that the night hours stretched ahead with all the comfort of a prison sentence. She understood, with absolute and devastating certainty, that she had made a grave miscalculation. The contract she had signed had been incomplete, as Fairfield had arranged it to be incomplete. The details that mattered most had been deliberately withheld. And now, sitting alone in a bedroom in a manner that belonged to a man who felt nothing for her, Vivienne confronted the reality that she had become an obstacle to something the Duke actually wanted. Whether he despised her for that obstacle or merely regarded her with indifferent tolerance seemed almost irrelevant. Either way, the next year stretched ahead with the prospect of enduring his presence while maintaining the fiction that this arrangement was anything other than a mistake that would cost her everything she was beginning to understand she had sacrificed. Lady Catherine remained at Lexington Manor for precisely 14 days. During that time, Vivian became acutely aware of how thoroughly invisible she could become within her own household. She managed the staff, attended meals, fulfilled social obligations, and felt with increasing certainty that she had become merely an ornament in a residence that had moved on without her. The letter arrived on the 5th day of Catherine's visit. It bore the seal of the Duke's man of business's office in London, and Vivian's hands trembled as she opened it, certain that some complication regarding her family had emerged. Instead, the contents proved far more personally destabilizing. The Duke's man of business wrote that Lord Fairfield had contacted him regarding legal matters pertaining to the Duke's will. There had been, he noted with careful language, some confusion regarding the exact specifications of the testamentary clause. It seemed the clause specified not merely that the Duke marry before his 33rd year, but that the marriage be entered into with genuine companionship and mutual regard as its foundation. The exact phrasing, reproduced in legal terminology, suggested that the testator had intended to prevent his son from marrying merely for convenience. Vivian read the letter 3 times. Each iteration revealed new implications that had escaped her comprehension previously. The contract she had signed with Fairfield made no mention of this requirement. Indeed, Fairfield had specifically emphasized that genuine affection was precisely what the Duke wished to avoid. There had been systematic deception woven through her agreement from its inception. She requested a meeting with Lord Fairfield through the household correspondence system. He arrived 2 days later, finding her in the small parlor adjacent to the library, a room the Dowager rarely visited, and therefore one that offered privacy. "There is a discrepancy in the terms you provided me," Vivian said without preamble. She extended the Duke's man of business's letter. "You omitted significant details regarding the testamentary requirements." Fairfield examined the letter with an expression that did not change. The full specifications were disclosed to the Duke. It was his decision to present the arrangement to you in the terms he selected. So the Duke deliberately misrepresented the contract to me. The Duke provided you with the information necessary for your agreement. The additional specifications regarding companionship are legally required elements of the will's satisfaction, but they are not external to the marriage itself. Genuine companionship develops within a marriage, or it does not. Vivienne felt anger crystallize within her. The Duke required me to sign a document that does not match the legal reality of what that document purports to accomplish. That is fraud, Lord Fairfield. It is a common feature of familial arrangements, Fairfield replied. However, the Duke was entirely aware that this element would eventually require clarification. He asked that I provide you with this information once you had settled into your role here. Why would he request such subterfuge? Fairfield set the letter carefully on the table. Because he believed you would not accept the contract if you understood that it required developing genuine affection for a man who had deliberately positioned himself as incapable of providing the same in return. The Duke's situation is more complicated than you have been given reason to understand. Vivian waited, understanding that silence was sometimes more effective than interrogation. The Duke's first marriage was not a happy union. Fairfield continued. His wife was carefully selected for rank and compatibility. The union produced an heir. It also produced profound unhappiness that culminated in his wife's death during childbirth. The child did not survive. The Duke has spent the past 4 years attempting to ensure that he would never again allow himself emotional attachment that could result in such catastrophic loss. Vivian felt her understanding shift. The clause in his father's will was designed to force him to overcome that, to force him toward the possibility of overcoming it. Whether he actually does remains within his own agency. However, the legal specifications require that the marriage contain elements of genuine companionship. This is where you, despite your initial deception regarding the full terms, possess significant leverage. If you choose to pursue legal action regarding the misrepresentation, the Duke's ability to satisfy his father's will becomes substantially compromised. Vivian moved to the window, looking out onto the frost-touched park. What would you have me do? That determination rests entirely with you. You may pursue legal remedy. You may demand the contract be rewritten with complete transparency, or you may acknowledge that the Duke was attempting, however imperfectly, to offer you both a solution to your family's circumstance and protection for himself from his own vulnerabilities. After he departed, Vivian remained alone in the small parlor as afternoon light shifted across the walls. She possessed a choice, though the parameters felt impossible to navigate. She could confront the Duke directly, demand transparency, insist upon terms reflecting actual reality. But confrontation would force him to acknowledge the deception, would eliminate the possibility of what might develop if she proceeded without that confrontation, and would potentially destroy whatever fragile connection had begun forming. Alternatively, she could remain silent, allow the arrangement to continue, permit him to maintain the fiction that his position required emotional distance. But that path led only toward the end of the contracted year, toward separation and anonymity, toward a future where she would have been nothing more than a brief interruption. That evening she encountered James in the library. Catherine had finally departed that afternoon, and the manor seemed to have exhaled in relief. He was standing before the fireplace when Vivian entered, and he turned at the sound of the door closing. "I have spoken with Fairfield regarding the testamentary specifications," she said, dispensing with courtesies. "I know what your father required. I know that you misrepresented the contract to me. I know that genuine companionship was always the actual goal." His expression shifted before settling on resignation. "I had hoped Fairfield would exercise greater discretion." "The issue was not discretion. You chose manipulation over honesty." "Yes," he said simply. "I did. Because I feared that if you understood the complete situation, you would refuse. And you would have been right to refuse." Vivian waited for more explanations or defenses. Instead, he simply stood in the firelight and accepted her accusation without mitigation. "Why did you choose me?" she finally asked. "If the arrangement required some possibility of genuine connection, why someone you had no prior association with? Because you possessed the intelligence to recognize a beneficial arrangement despite its irregularity, and because your vulnerability seemed temporary, resulting from circumstance rather than character. I believed you would understand that this was a transaction. I did not anticipate that either of us would develop feelings that complicated that understanding." The admission hung between them, neither quite an apology nor quite an evasion. It was the closest approximation to honesty that his pride and his fear would permit. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "That remains entirely your decision. Fairfield informed me that you possess grounds for legal remedy regarding the misrepresentation. If you choose to pursue such remedy, I will not contest it. If you choose to separate the marriage entirely, I will ensure that your family remains protected. And if I choose to remain?" He looked at her directly, and in his eyes was something resembling both hope and terror in equal measure. "Then we begin again, knowing the truth. We attempt to develop whatever genuine companionship your presence might make possible, without the barrier of deliberate omission." Vivian understood that this was the moment where her decision would matter in earnest. She could pursue justice for the deception, or she could accept that they were both injured people attempting to navigate circumstances neither had fully chosen. She could demand honesty now and force him to confront complications, or she could acknowledge that they were already engaged in the far more difficult work of building something genuine from the rubble of manipulation and fear. "We begin again," she said quietly, "but with complete transparency from this point forward. No more omissions." "Complete transparency," he agreed, beginning immediately. The week following Vivian's decision to remain unfolded with peculiar normalcy. James began discussing matters previously handled in isolation. He sought her opinion on estate concerns with apparent sincerity, spent evening hours in conversation rather than solitude. To outside observers, the marriage had shifted toward something resembling a conventional union. To Vivian, it felt like both progress and performance. But the world beyond Lexington Manor was not content to allow them their fragile reconstruction. Gossip spreads with the inevitability of fire requiring only minimal fuel. It began with whispers at a Bath musicale where Vivian's mother had attended as companion to an elderly friend. Lady Harrison mentioned to her circle that she had heard extraordinary tales regarding the Duke and Duchess. A servant with household connections had confided that the Duke and Duchess maintained separate chambers and that the marriage had never been consummated. Such an assertion, delivered by someone of Lady Harrison's standing, transformed gossip into scandal. From Bath, information traveled to London. From London, it dispersed outward like ink in water, growing darker as it circulated. By the time it reached the pages of a gossip magazine, the narrative had crystallized into certainty. The Duke had married secretly. The marriage was fraudulent, designed to satisfy legal requirements. The Duchess was maintained as a decorative accessory, her primary function unfulfilled. The catalyst was Lady Catherine Westcott. She had observed how James's attention was beginning to deviate from herself toward Vivian. When Catherine encountered a gossip columnist at a London event, she happened to mention, in passing, and with apparent reluctance, that she had heard unsettling reports regarding the Duke's marriage. She would not ordinarily repeat such talk, she indicated, but given the irregularity of the arrangement, she felt obligated to concern herself with her dear friend's reputation. Within a fortnight, Lexington Manor found itself at the center of considerable scandal. Calls from acquaintances diminished. Invitations previously extended routinely were suddenly delayed or withdrawn. The Dowager received letters expressing concern and suggesting that clarification seemed necessary. The Dowager delivered the information to Vivian directly in the morning room, producing a gossip magazine folded to a particular page where a column speculated openly about the legitimacy of their marriage and questioned whether the Duke had found himself entrapped by a woman of questionable background. "The entire ton is speaking of nothing else," the Dowager said with an absence of sympathy that seemed almost gleeful. "I have received inquiries from 3 families regarding whether we intend to clarify these matters. Your temporary position may prove to have more lasting consequences than any of us anticipated." Vivian felt the words as a physical blow. She had known intellectually that the arrangement carried risk, but she had not comprehended what it would mean when that risk materialized into public accusation. Her family would be connected to this scandal. Her sister, newly engaged, might find her match in jeopardy. The security she had fought to provide was now threatened. She found James in his study reviewing estate accounts. "There is a scandal," she said without preamble. "The London papers are speculating about our marriage's legitimacy. Lady Catherine has been instrumental in disseminating information regarding our separate chambers." James set down his pen with careful deliberation. "I am aware. Fairfield brought me the publication this morning. He advised that we prepare for a period of social difficulty extending several weeks. My sister's engagement could be compromised. My family's reputation is at risk." "Yes," he said quietly. "That consequence appears probable." His calm acceptance of the situation without immediate action somehow made it worse. Vivian had anticipated defensiveness or expressions of regret. His acknowledgement of the damage transformed the scandal from external assault into something he had perhaps anticipated. "What will you do?" she demanded. "What would you have me do?" The question contained genuine uncertainty. Vivian found herself momentarily without answer. The scandal could not be undone. The truth, that their marriage had begun as a contract and developed into something more complicated, would satisfy no one. A public declaration of affection would seem performative. "We must present the marriage as genuine," she finally said. "We must be seen together publicly. We must allow society to observe that we are not estranged. That would require your cooperation to a degree that the contract does not mandate," James replied. "Public scrutiny would necessitate considerable performance. I will not demand such an endeavor." "You are not demanding anything. I am insisting. My family's security depends upon this appearing legitimate." He approached her. "Is that what you believe? That we are merely performing legitimacy?" "I believe we are 2 people who began this under false pretenses, attempting to salvage something from that falsity. Whether what we are building is genuine may matter more to us than to society." Over the following days, they undertook a campaign of conspicuous togetherness. They attended the opera, sitting in the Duke's box with visible proximity. They attended garden parties, walking arm in arm. They accepted ballroom invitations where they danced multiple times, creating the impression of a couple genuinely comfortable together. James undertook conversations with influential society members. He did not deny the rumors directly. Instead, he suggested his wife's background was entirely respectable, that their courtship, while rapid, had been conducted with proper discretion. He indicated that personal matters were not appropriate for public discussion, and that assumptions based on household architecture were perhaps premature. The Dowager, observing their public presentation and recognizing the strategy was producing results, became more active than previously. She was seen in company with Vivienne, the women presenting a united front suggesting the marriage had full family endorsement. When questioned, the Dowager responded with authority that came from her position and apparent confidence in the union's legitimacy. She did not defend the marriage, obviously. Instead, she simply refused to acknowledge that scandal existed, treating the entire matter with dismissive indifference of someone utterly convinced of its baseless nature. Gradually, the narrative shifted. Society, eager to move to fresher scandal, released its focus on Lexington. The gossip magazine was discredited when it became clear it had been deliberately provided false information. Lady Catherine found herself increasingly isolated at social functions, with the Ton's attention turning toward her as the architect of baseless rumor. One evening, approximately 3 weeks after the scandal reached its apex, Vivienne encountered James in the library. They had fallen into a routine of sharing that space in late hours, maintaining a distance that seemed intentional, as though acknowledging that performance required for society need not extend to private moments. "Your family remains secure," he said without preamble. "Fairfield has confirmed your sister's engagement is not threatened. The Earl's family considers the matter of our marriage's legitimacy entirely unimportant. Your mother wrote expressing gratitude and concern for your welfare." Vivienne felt her family had been partially unnecessary, that society had moved past scandal more readily than feared. The knowledge produced relief mixed with something resembling disappointment. "And your concern?" she asked quietly. "What did you feel regarding the scandal?" James turned from the fire. "I felt that I had brought unnecessary harm to you. I felt my initial deception produced consequences extending beyond our arrangement. I felt something approaching protective instinct, which my father's will and my previous experience had taught me was dangerous to acknowledge." He moved toward her slowly, as though approaching something that might take flight. "During the scandal, when you insisted we present ourselves as genuinely married, I realized I could not return to the distance characterizing our early months. The performance had become indistinguishable from reality." Vivienne felt her breath become shallow. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that the contract binding us has been superseded by something requiring no legal specification. Whether this began as fraud or manipulation or mutual desperation is increasingly irrelevant. What matters is what we have constructed in the space between those falsehoods and this present moment." He reached for her hand. This time, there was no pulling away. The spring rain fell against the windows of Lexington Manor with a persistence that matched the turmoil occurring within its walls. Nearly a year had passed since Vivienne first arrived, and the manor that had felt foreign now held the weight of genuine attachment. Yet it was precisely that attachment that had led to the conversation currently taking place in James's study. "The contract has concluded its purpose," James said, his voice carrying the deliberate calm of someone who had practiced these words extensively. "The scandal has been managed. Your family remains secure. The testamentary requirements have been satisfied through the appearance of a functioning marriage. You are no longer bound by the original agreement, Vivienne. I have instructed Fairfield to prepare documentation for an articles of separation that would provide you with financial independence and the freedom to pursue whatever future you might wish." Vivienne stood motionless, processing the words that constituted a release she had not anticipated at this particular moment. "You are offering me an escape. I am offering you a choice. Continuing this marriage would require you to accept the reality of who I am and what I am capable of offering. I have spent considerable time determining whether I am capable of offering anything more than the dysfunction that characterized my first marriage. The conclusion I have reached is that I am fundamentally damaged in ways that may not be reparable. You are offering escape because you are afraid," Vivienne said quietly, "not because you believe it is what I want. What you want is irrelevant to what you deserve. You deserve a husband who can meet you without reservation, who does not harbor fears that intimacy will result in catastrophic loss, who can engage in the fundamental elements of matrimony without experiencing something approaching terror." The confession hung between them, the first genuine articulation of the fear that had governed his behavior since their marriage began. Vivienne moved toward him, and he did not retreat. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened. Tell me what you have never spoken aloud." James looked away, toward the windows where rain continued its relentless descent. "My first wife was pregnant within 3 months of our marriage. Society required it. Her family required it. My father required it. She was young, only 19, and she had been raised with all the genteel instruction and none of the genuine knowledge necessary to comprehend what pregnancy would demand of her body. The physicians assured me that she was healthy, that the pregnancy progressed normally, that there was no reason to anticipate complication." He paused, and Vivienne recognized the pause as the moment where memory became unbearable to articulate. The labor lasted nearly 2 days. I waited in the corridor outside her chambers, and I heard her screams intensify hour after hour until they became something other than human. The physicians emerged at intervals with expressions that became progressively more grave. I knew what was happening before they told me. The child was positioned incorrectly. Her body was too small. The hemorrhaging would not stop. James's voice had become barely audible. They informed me that I must choose. They could attempt to save my son by performing procedures that would certainly result in my wife's death, or they could allow both to die. I made the choice to save my son. Neither of them survived. Vivienne felt tears on her own cheeks, though she was not certain when they had begun. James. The child lived for 3 hours after birth. He was perfect. He was mine. And then he simply ceased. I held him as he died, and I understood with absolute certainty that the very act of creating another human being, of requiring my wife to undergo the process of gestation and childbirth, had resulted in the annihilation of everything I had created. My father's response was to tell me that I had made an error in my choice, that I should have sacrificed my son for my wife, that the continuation of the line required that I select another bride and attempt again, but the notion of deliberately placing another woman in a situation where she might experience what my first wife experienced seemed to me equivalent to murder. "That is why the contract required separation," Vivienne said, understanding crystallizing. "That is why you maintained distance. You were attempting to guarantee that you would never place another woman in the position of becoming pregnant." "Yes. I believed that if I married for convenience, if I maintained emotional distance, if I ensured that intimacy remained impossible, I could satisfy the testamentary requirement while protecting whatever woman agreed to the arrangement from the catastrophic consequences of genuine marriage to me." Vivienne reached for his hand. This time, he did not pull away. "What changed?" "You changed everything by refusing to remain at the comfortable distance I had constructed. You insisted on knowing the truth. You confronted the deception. You chose to remain despite understanding precisely what I had withheld from you. And in that choice, I began to understand that the fear I harbored was not only preventing me from harming another person, but also preventing me from being anything other than a man defined entirely by grief and terror. I cannot promise you that intimacy would not result in pregnancy," Vivienne said quietly. "I cannot promise that childbirth carries no risks. But I can promise you that I understand those risks, that I am not a frightened girl unprepared for the realities of a woman's body. And I can promise you that whatever future we build together, whatever consequences emerge from genuine partnership, would be infinitely preferable to the life either of us has been living in the shadow of prevention and distance. You would accept all of that. The possibility of loss, the repetition of trauma, the inability to guarantee safety. I would accept it because the alternative is to live as you have been living, separate from yourself, separate from anyone who might matter to you, separate from the possibility of genuine love because you have decided that genuine love is too dangerous to permit." James pulled her toward him, and the embrace that followed held the weight of all the distance that had preceded it. When he finally drew back enough to see her face, his own was marked with tears. "I do not deserve your understanding," he said. "No," Vivienne agreed, "but you have it regardless. The question is, what you will do with it." "I'm going to spend the rest of my life attempting to become someone worthy of it," James replied. "I'm going to allow myself to love you without the constant anticipation of catastrophe, and I am going to trust that you possess sufficient strength to navigate whatever future we create together." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a document. This is the Articles of Separation papers, unsigned. I am placing the choice entirely with you. Remain or depart. Build a genuine marriage or accept the freedom I have offered. Whatever you choose, I will accept." Vivian took the papers and, without reading them, placed them directly into the fire. She watched them ignite and char, watched the legal documentation of escape dissolve into ash and smoke. "I choose to remain," she said. "I choose you. Not the arrangement, not the contract, not the performance. You." The afternoon that Lord Fairfield arrived with news of Lady Catherine's involvement in the distribution of false information marked the beginning of the final dissolution of the chaos that had governed the previous months. James received the report in his study, his expression hardening as he listened to the detailed accounting of how Catherine had deliberately cultivated relationships with gossip columnists and how she had systematically provided them with selective information designed to damage the credibility of his marriage. "What do you recommend?" James asked, his voice containing an edge that Fairfield had learned to recognize as controlled fury. "The evidence is substantial enough that you could pursue legal action," Fairfield replied carefully. "Lady Catherine acted with clear intent to cause harm. The damages to your reputation and your wife's position in society provide grounds for significant compensation. However, such action would necessarily prolong the scandal. The Ton would continue discussing the matter throughout the proceedings. Alternatively, you might simply ensure that her actions carry social consequences without requiring formal legal intervention." James considered this. He understood that revenge, however justified, would only extend the period during which Vivian and his household remained subjects of public scrutiny. "Ensure that the evidence reaches the appropriate members of society," he finally said, "but do so quietly. I do not wish this to become another spectacle." Within days, the evidence of Lady Catherine's deliberate campaign became known among London's most influential families. The discretion with which the information was disseminated somehow made it more damaging than if it had been broadcast openly. Lady Catherine found herself systematically excluded from social functions. Hostesses who had previously competed for her presence suddenly discovered they had insufficient space at their gatherings. Gentlemen who had flirted with her now treated her with pointed indifference. And then came the announcement that her marriage to the late Lord Ashworth was being examined by ecclesiastical authorities regarding its validity, a process initiated not by James, but by Lord Ashworth's family, who had apparently decided that the widow's conduct reflected poorly on their name. Within 6 weeks, Lady Catherine withdrew from London entirely. She departed for the continent with what remained of her fortune and her dignity, leaving behind a scandal that quickly faded into the background of society's endlessly shifting preoccupations. More significantly, when she had made her final appearance at a ball before her departure, Vivian had encountered her in the retiring room. They faced each other in the mirror as their respective maids attended to their toilettes, and in that moment of confrontation, Vivian made a decision that James would never fully understand until she explained it to him later that evening. "I could have ensured that what you did to me was repaid with severity," Vivian said quietly, meeting Catherine's eyes in the reflection. "The evidence of your actions provides ample justification for complete social destruction. But I find that I do not wish to spend my energy on revenge when I might instead spend it on building something genuine." Catherine's expression shifted, and for a moment, something almost resembling gratitude flickered across her features before she turned away without responding. When Vivian recounted this exchange to James, he reached for her hand with an intensity that suggested the significance of her choice reverberated through him in profound ways. "You offered her mercy she did not deserve," he said. "I offered her what you needed to see was possible," Vivian replied, "that people are capable of choosing compassion even when cruelty would be justified, that the continuation of cycles of harm requires only that we maintain our commitment to perpetuating them. Breaking that cycle requires deliberate choice." 2 months after the scandal had fully dissipated, James summoned Lord Fairfield to Lexington Manor for a purpose that had nothing to do with legal complications or contractual amendments. Instead, he produced the original documents of his father's will and the testamentary clause that had begun the entire arrangement. He carried them to the fireplace in his study, and Vivian stood beside him as he prepared to commit them to flame. "The legal requirements are satisfied," he said. looking at her rather than at the documents. The marriage is valid through every measure that society and law require, but I have decided that I no longer wish to be governed by my father's posthumous demands, or by the fear that the will contained my only justification for choosing you. He placed the documents in the fire and watched them ignite, watched the legal specifications and the testamentary requirements dissolve into ash and smoke. This marriage exists now because we choose it, he continued. Not because a contract required it, not because a will mandated it, not because fear and manipulation drove us together. We remain married because we have decided, deliberately and with full knowledge of what that choice requires, that we wish to continue together. Vivian watched the documents burn, and she understood that this moment represented the final dissolution of the arrangement that had begun in Fairfield's office nearly a year and a half earlier. The contract had been superseded. The manipulation had been acknowledged and addressed. The fraud had been confronted and accepted. What remained was something that bore no resemblance to those origins, something built deliberately on honesty and choice and genuine affection. In the months that followed, life at Lexington Manor assumed a rhythm that would have seemed impossible during the early months of their union. James stopped spending nights pacing the library. Vivian ceased her habit of listening for his movements through the corridors. They shared chambers now, though not always in the way society might have anticipated. Some nights they simply read together. Other nights they talked until dawn approached. Increasingly, they found themselves engaged in the intimate aspects of marriage that had been impossible while fear and distance governed their interactions. Letters arrived from Vivian's family with regular frequency. Her mother had written to describe the cottage she had rented in Bath, the friends she had made, the life of genuine comfort and security that she had begun to construct. Harriet had married her Earl's second son in a ceremony that was, by all accounts, genuinely joyful. The family was thriving, and the security that Vivian had fought so desperately to provide had been transformed from a temporary arrangement into something permanent and sustainable. The Dowager Duchess, observing the genuine affection that had developed between her son and his wife, gradually softened from her position of critical distance. She began to spend time with Vivian, not as a test of her adequacy, but as something approaching companionship. She even, on one occasion, offered what might charitably be interpreted as an apology for her initial treatment of the new Duchess. And James, who had spent 4 years believing that genuine emotional connection was incompatible with survival, discovered that love was not the catastrophic force he had feared, but rather the thing that had saved him from a life of carefully maintained distance and perpetual isolation. He learned to trust that Vivian possessed agency and strength sufficient to navigate whatever future they constructed together. He learned that protecting someone did not require denying them choice. And he learned, perhaps most importantly, that the past, whether it contained grief or fear or the weight of decisions that could never be undone, could be transformed through genuine connection and deliberate choice into something that no longer governed the present. On the anniversary of their marriage, a year after the contract had been signed in Fairfield's office, James and Vivian stood in the gallery at Lexington Manor. He had brought her to see a portrait that had been commissioned by a painter of considerable skill. It depicted them together, not in the formal poses society might have demanded, but in a moment of genuine connection, her hand resting on his arm, his gaze directed toward her rather than toward the viewer, both of them captured in an expression that suggested something beyond mere social arrangement. "This is who we have become," James said quietly, studying the painting. Not the arrangement, not the contract, not the fraud. This. Vivian placed her head against his shoulder. "This is who we chose to become," she corrected gently. "And that choice, made freely and deliberately, is what makes it real."